me or at least monitor that, and we can follow up with them a little bit later.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. All right. So it's 10:30. Let's go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. This is our first CCSW Disciples Connect webinar or conversation, whatever you want to call these, broadcast. I'll be playing the role of Oprah. And my host today are two people that I value their friendship. I value them as colleagues, as ministers, and I value the work that they do with the Christian Church Foundation. Bobby Hawley is, and Marilyn Fiddmont, Reverends Bobby Hawley and Marilyn Fiddmont are vice presidents with Christian Church Foundation. And our role and our goal in these CCSW Disciples Connect conversations is to let general ministry partners that the church ought to know about, talk about what they do and how they can be of service to the church. So I'm not going to try to give a long introduction of these two people. They promised me they would be on their best behavior. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Marilyn and Bobby and let you all say welcome. And you've prepared some conversation points, so we'll launch the PowerPoint here when you're ready for it.
Great. Thank you, Andy. On behalf of myself and Marilyn and all of the Christian Church Foundation, it's good to be with you today. We appreciate this opportunity. Our goal is simply to give those that may not be familiar with the Christian Church Foundation an introduction to who we are and what we do, what the goal of our ministry is, and how we can partner with those throughout the life of the church. Andy already said, I'm Bobby Hawley. I'm based in Fort Worth, Texas, and serve the South Central zone of the foundation. Marilyn lives and offices in Houston and serves the Southwest zone, which includes New Mexico, Arizona, Pacific Southwest, and she also has the Northeast zone. So a little kind of bi-coastal thing going on there with Marilyn. But we are delighted. And the fact that Marilyn has lived for a long, long time in Houston, she works with some of the congregations down in that area as well. And she and I work closely together in serving the Coastal Plains area. As simply put, as I know how to say it, the mission of the Christian Church Foundation is to work with members of our church to promote the establishment and growth of permanent endowment funds that will support and sustain ministry in perpetuity. So what does that mean and how do we do it? We work with individuals and families to do inheritance and gift planning. We work with congregations as well as other regional and general church ministries and regional ministries, Juliet Fowler Homes, Inman Christian Center, Southwest Good Samaritan Ministries, general church ministries like Global Ministries, Week of Compassion, and all of the others. And we work with them to establish effective permanent fund policies. Thirdly, we work with entities to provide efficient and effective and prudent endowment fund management. And lastly, somewhat sadly, but it's a reality in the world in which we live, some congregations outlive their lifespan. They make a decision that they are no longer viable. And so we work with congregations to provide, to plan for a permanent legacy when they need to close their visible ministry. So those are really kind of an overview, the four highlights of what we do in working with individuals and working with congregations and other ministries in the life of the church. And Marilyn and I will touch on each of those four phases of our ministry over the course of the next few minutes here. First of all, to talk about the establishment and growth of permanent funds, many individuals create permanent endowment funds through direct gifts to the Christian Church Foundation. They can do that through a variety of ways, lifetime gifts, bequests from by will or by trust, charitable remainder trust, a variety of types of assets can be transferred to us. But the ultimate goal is to create a named permanent endowment fund, and the donor creates a permanent fund to gift agreement that directs us, the Christian Church Foundation, to whom we make the distributions on an annual basis based on the donor's intent, the donor's instructions, and the donor's guidance. And we honor those as if we take that as a sacred responsibility and honor those instructions from the donors. I guess the next couple of things that I want to say, I'm going to kind of scroll through these fairly quickly, is yes, we manage a lot of money at the Christian Church Foundation. Currently, the Christian Church Foundation has somewhere north of $950 million under management. But our goal is to use those resources that have been entrusted to us to further the mission and ministry of the church. It's summed up in a quote by our president, Gary Kidwell, who said, "Our goal is moving money to mission." That's just what we do. We want to use the resources that are entrusted to us by donors to make mission and ministry in the life of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ possible.
Hey, Bobby, can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
Can you give us one specific example of what that might look like? Just give us a scenario, or Marilyn, give us a scenario of what a donation from a local congregation's perspective. What might that look like for them?
Marilyn, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Andy. Good question. One of the things that congregations oftentimes consider is what the entirety of their assets. And so they may have some funds that have been sitting in a local account. They're not making much, and they realize that they have a real passion for outreach. We have congregations who create funds that when they take a certain distribution rate, they use those for their outreach purposes. And so it's not only to undergird a particular operating budget, but sometimes it's a specific entity or ministry within the life of their community, within the life of the church. So they figure out what is the best use of these dollars, because the dollars ultimately should impact lives, and they figure out how to do that. So it may be to create a special fund for local church outreach or for a week of compassion, but it's a matter of getting those funds moved beyond just what they would think of would be their typical capacity.
Right. So we have Bethany Christian Church down in Houston. I believe that they set up a fund that would benefit Week of Compassion every year. And so the way that would work, as I understood it, they raised, I want to say $50,000 that they invested in Christian Church Foundation. And then they don't draw out of that $50,000 each year, but rather they take a draw from the interest earned or the earnings of that each year. And that's part of what they give to Week of Compassion every year. Is that a fairly typical example of a church setting up this kind of foundation?
I think that's right, Andy. There are a lot of congregations that, Week of Compassion is promoted a program called, I think it's Circle of Compassion. Is that right?
That sounds right. Mm-hmm.
I think it's a minimum of $10,000 and it's invested with the Christian Church Foundation. And then, as you said, the earnings from that every year go to back to Week of Compassion's operating budget, not the corpus, but the earnings every year. Individuals can do a Circle of Compassion gift for a permanent fund for only $1,000. We have that kind of partnership with a lot of general ministries, Disciples Men, Disciples Women, Black Endowment Fund, a number of different entities where an individual or a congregation can set up a named permanent fund specifically for that ministry. Mm-hmm. But an individual can also set up a named permanent fund, create a permanent fund gift agreement, and then name who they want the beneficiaries to be.
So that could be their church's food pantry or their outreach department and the local ministries that they give to in the.
Or who knows, it could be to benefit the region.
Yes, thank you.
Wouldn't that be great?
I'd love it. Amen. Yeah, sure. Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I just wanted to.
No. That's helpful.
To think in specific examples. So that's great.
Absolutely. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go along. Marilyn is going to focus on permanent fund policies in a little bit. And so that we'll get into some of that as well.
Okay.
I guess the other thing I want to say while we're on this topic of kind of moving money to mission, in 2 slides down the road here, skip over the next one. I just gave in the past comments, I said an individual can set up a named endowment fund for only $1,000. I use this illustration of the mustard seed because our focus, a lot of people think that you've got to be extremely wealthy to be a philanthropist, to make an estate gift or an endowment fund. We don't think that at all. You don't have to be extremely wealthy. You just have to be exceedingly generous. You have to be committed to generosity. And frankly, we think that is true of most people within the life of the church. So we and our partner ministries have intentionally set the minimums fairly low in order for people to be able to do that. In order to start a named endowment fund at the Christian Church Foundation, it only requires $1,000 minimum. In order to start making distributions from that fund, it requires $10,000. So again, and $1,000 fund or even a $10,000 fund distributing 4% is not going to distribute much. But when that's accumulated along with hundreds and thousands of other donors across the life of our church, it makes a difference. It makes a big difference. So that's why we do that. We truly believe that asking people for money is about giving them permission, giving them the opportunity to participate in building up the kingdom. It's just that simple. Stewardship, including stewardship of accumulated resources, our legacy giving, is part of our responsibility. It's part of our discipline as faithful Christians. But specifically, when you're talking about stewardship, we don't just talk about at the Christian Church Foundation stewardship as it pertains to one's giving to the operating budget in their congregation. But we specifically talk about planned giving. While it's not always the case, but oftentimes planned gifts require considerably more thought and preparation and planning than what goes into deciding how much you're going to pledge to your congregation's annual fund. Sometimes people give from their brokerage accounts and they want to be tax smart about how to do that most efficiently. So they want to consult with a broker or an accountant. Sometimes people use land or real estate, and so they want to determine the most effective way to do that. For some people, it involves charitable gift annuities or charitable trust, things that require more thought and planning than what usually goes into a gift. So that's one of the differences about what we do at the Christian Church Foundation. Next, I want to really just focus on the various ways that people can give. As I was just beginning to describe just now, some of it can be more complex, if you will, depending on the size of someone's estate, their complexity of their assets. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's fairly simple. People want to make a $10,000 cash gift from their accumulated assets, savings, a brokerage account. Maybe they want to transfer stock. You can give now to create a named permanent fund or to create a donor advised fund. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what that is, but it's one of the vehicles or instruments that is used for gifting assets. I've got up here on the slide, QCD, Qualified Charitable Distribution from an IRA, is an extremely important and helpful tool that the IRS now allows people that are 70 and a half or older to distribute as much as $100,000 a year to charity as part of their required minimum distribution and not pay taxes on it. So it's an efficient way that a lot of people have begun making gifts to permanent funds or directly to their congregations. Again, they could give it to the region. They could give it to a variety of charities or ministries that they want to support. Give later, people can, one of the primary things that we frankly promote is legacy giving through end of life gifts, to put plans in place now so that at your death, either through will or trust or beneficiary designation, the gifts that you want to make will flow directly to the Christian Church Foundation or to your congregation or whatever ministries you want to benefit. There are a couple of different gift instruments that I'm not going to go into detail to describe, that we describe as give now and give later. Charitable gift annuities and charitable remainder trust are ways in which you can fully, irrevocably gift an asset through the Christian Church Foundation, but you retain a lifetime interest or income from that gift annuity or from that trust. And then at your death, or at the death of the donors, if it's a husband and wife, at the death of the second to die, then the remainder or residual of that gift will flow to charity. So you make the gift, but you retain an income interest in it for your lifetime. And then at your death, the residual goes to charity. So those are some important, jump in, Marilyn.
I just wanted to interject with that. Oftentimes there's a considerable tax benefit for doing that. Not only is it to create an income stream, oftentimes you need the additional income, but it also may serve as a real tax benefit for those donors. It highly appreciated assets that doing those creates the income stream, increases the benefit to the charity after lifetime, and it's a win-win, shall we say. Thanks, Bobby.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Thanks for jumping in, Marilyn. I'm trying to kind of talk fast and cover as much material as we can in a relatively short period of time. And I think what you said is extremely important. Andy, what you said in your introduction, Marilyn and I are both ordained ministers. Our goal is to preach and teach about the stewardship of accumulated resources. So technically, we don't give tax advice or legal advice, but we're also gift planners. And so we work with donors to plan the most efficient way to make a gift. The way that will benefit.
Just as an interjection of testimony, both with the two of you and with others from Foundation that I've worked with, I've always had, both as a local church pastor and as regional minister, I have always had the experience of believing and experiencing that I was communicating with a ministry first and asset managers second. That has always been the thing I have said about Foundation and the things I've said to Foundation. I so appreciate the fact that that's not just a slogan that's on a plaque somewhere. That has been lived out time and time and time again in my conversations with the two of you and with others. So encourage other people to interact with you as well as they're trying to make sense out of their church's resources and how to be good stewards of that. I just find the two of you great conversation partners for that work.
Great, thank you. I guess the last thing I want to say kind of in this section of my presentation, then I'm going to turn it over to Marilyn in just a minute, is you can go on to that next one. As I said in my opening remarks, I'm based in Fort Worth, and my territory, if you will, covers all of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Marilyn is based out of Houston, and she covers a wide territory: New Mexico, Arizona, Pacific Southwest, and New York, and the Northeast region. We cannot be at every congregation as much as we would like. We try to be as responsive, both by phone and email and other forms of social media to our donors and our ministers as we can. And we try to visit as often as we can. But the reality is, to truly promote inheritance or legacy giving within a congregation requires the commitment of the pastor and of committed lay leaders. So a number of years ago, we came to this realization that we can't be all things to all people, and we can't be everywhere all the time. So we created this program, if you will, that we call the mentoring model. And it's a relationship-based way for congregations to invite and encourage individuals within your congregation to plan for a legacy, an end-of-life gift to benefit the congregation. It is a program in which lay leaders who are willing to say, I've included the church in my estate plan, and I hope you will as also. At no point in the program does anyone tell anyone else how much they should give or when they should give or how should they give, but it simply encourages people to include the church in a legacy gift plan. So I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that other than to say we have resources about that. And Marilyn and I, and as you said, Andy, our other colleagues across the life of the church are available to work with pastors and lay leaders to help launch this kind of a program within a local church. The next slide goes into a little bit of detail about it, but that's really the gist of what this does. It helps put the responsibility within the local leaders to ask for gifts, to promote the program, and to encourage follow-up.
Great.
The thing I'm going to pass the torch, so to speak, to Marilyn now. One of the things that we really talk about is if we do our job well and we work with congregations and lay leaders, pastors, to encourage the growth of gifts, then congregations will begin to receive wills, bequests, and legacy gifts. So what do you do next? Marilyn?
Thank you, Bobby. One of the major things that we talk about is what happens with the first big gift. We typically say within the life of the Christian Church Foundation, every congregation stands to receive a gift from an estate, maybe a gift during lifetime that is unexpected. And you have some options with what you will do with that first gift. One is that you can have the biggest church fight you've ever had. You really can. This can be worse than a family feud. You can spend it. Often congregations will say, finally, we have the resources to pay off, to do this, to do that, to buy something. You can deposit it in a CD with the local bank and get that robust $2 or so a month, whatever it might be. Or better yet, you can have a policy in place that will direct that gift. And we always advocate, have the policy ahead of time so you know exactly what's going to happen when you receive that gift. You will know how it's going to be invested, you will know the distribution, and you'll know how to report it to the congregation or to the donor. And one of the things we always advocate is find those numerous ways to say thank you for that gift. But a policy is one of the critical issues in starting that process, so you don't have to worry about that church fight. So we're going to go on to the next one. We have available, as Bobby has mentioned, we have available some various samples of a permanent fund policy. One of the critical things is to say, what is the purpose of the fund? What is it designed to do? We have some language, and this can be, it serves as a model for the congregation, but you can enhance that or tweak that based on what the needs of the church may be. So you want to say what the purpose is. Why do we have this fund in the first place? What is it designed to do? The next one on the permanent fund policy, the model policy, what type of gifts? What is the congregation willing to receive and what is it not willing to receive? You think that, oh yeah, we take everything. You may not want to. Oftentimes, particularly in cases of real estate, I've known a congregation here in the Houston area that received a sliver of land that is near our large airport, IAH, and they will never be able to do anything but pay taxes on it. So we advocate, think about what type of gifts you want to receive and what you can do with those gifts. Have endowment trustees. We talk about the role of those trustees. what they're responsible to do, how they report back to the congregation. An annual spending for ministry, oftentimes we refer to the JIT rate, and that is established by Christian Church Foundation, established at a rate that is designed to reinvest, that we may make more than what you will want to distribute. So in other words, your corpus of your fund continues to grow. So you take a specific rate, you know what that's going to be. You try not to go over that, so your fund will continue to grow. Amending procedures. One of the things that you want to have in place is periodically you look at a policy. You don't do this every year, but you do want to periodically review your policy and see if there's something that needs to be changed or amended. And finally, the termination component to the permanent fund policy. And that oftentimes happens if a congregation does come to the end of life. They have funds invested with us. And what will happen to those funds if the congregation ceases its visible ministry? That's
Marilyn, along those lines. So to give us an example of this, if a congregation had, say, $100,000 endowment or a foundation, their annual spending for ministry might be, your advice is a 4% draw, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because
that is correct.
On
it's
average, that's going to grow by 7% on average over a course of time. And so this allows the corpus to grow and provide annual money for ministry. So on $100,000, that would be a $4,000 annual draw, roughly, that the congregation would then direct according to its values and according to the policies it's set up in this with foundation. It's determined how you're going to spend that money and how you're not going to spend that money. And then on the termination of the fund or the congregation, I know from just our experience in the last 3 years that when a church sells its building, those monies have to be entrusted to another nonprofit. They have to be distributed to another nonprofit. Is the same restrictions on a permanent fund of this nature? Are those fund monies if the congregation concludes its visible ministry, are those funds need to be distributed to a nonprofit at that point?
Andy, we've had that question come up, and here's what I've discovered with the congregations I've worked with, particularly in the Pacific Southwest region. They already had funds with us. And so it was an easy walk from having those in it was an easy walk to transfer those into a named permanent fund. They became a legacy congregation. One congregation had a couple of $100,000 invested. So they changed that from a fund that they owned and placed it into a permanent fund with Christian Church Foundation. It became their legacy fund. That was a pretty easy walk for them. Others may do something a little different. Bobby may have a different story, but for the ones I've worked with, as they were closing, it was an easy shift to becoming a legacy permanent fund. Bobby?
Well, yeah, I think what Marilyn is saying is absolutely correct. But Andy, if I heard you correctly, you were asking a different question. You asked if they sell their building, sell their property, or if they have funds invested at the Christian Church Foundation, do those funds, do those assets have to be distributed to another charity or not-for-profit? And if that was your question, which I think it was, the answer to that is absolutely. Because the funds, the people who gave those funds to the church to begin with got a tax deduction for them, and it was given to a church, a not-for-profit. The irony is, I'm laughing because I met with a small congregation in Louisiana a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, and it was sadly, like a lot of churches, it was going through the process of terminating its ministry. And I was sitting in the living room of a lady, a matriarch of that church, and there were 8 or 10 other people in her living room sitting around visiting about the process that we're going to go through. And they wanted to just take the assets and divide it up among themselves. After all, we're the members, aren't we? You can't do that.
Can't do that.
Kind of take a dim view of that.
And Bobby
Monies that were given for charitable purposes have to be transferred over to another charity. Now, it doesn't have to be a church charity, frankly. We hope that it would be,
Right.
because that's the way the people prior to them gave the money to build up a disciples church. So we at the Christian Church Foundation feel very strongly that those dollars ought to stay within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Right.
But some congregations upon closing distribute their assets, or at least a part of their assets, to local charities that they have supported and felt in partnership with over the years.
Right. And so, but what I'm hearing Marilyn say is they don't necessarily have to dissolve that and distribute the resources. They can set up a legacy fund, which would say a third of the dividends will go to their region, a third of their dividends will go to Week of Compassion, a third of their dividends would go to New Church, and they could set the percentages that way, and would Christian Church Foundation then execute those funds annually without there having to be one member who actually punches in the figures?
That's absolutely correct. It's a permanent fund gift agreement that continues in perpetuity. And while we want the vast majority of those distributions, as I just said, to stay within the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, they can include some non-church related qualified charity as one of the beneficiaries of their legacy fund.
Habitat for Humanity or something.
Yeah. Habitat, a local food bank. We just have to verify its 501c3 status.
Gotcha. Great.
As Bobby is saying, oftentimes congregations, it is, thank you for including both perspectives in that, because one of the things that some congregations have done is they will go ahead with local charities that they've supported, and they have said, these are 2 years, this is what we would send you for 2 years, here it is now, this is our last gift. And oftentimes make those distributions before they formally close the doors, and to let those ministries know that how much they've appreciated them and yet want to support them. So it's kind of both, and as Bobby has said, it is a little bit of both. We literally have had meetings with folks who said, can we divide this amongst ourselves? And Andy, Bobby, orange will not be my new black. It just so we discourage that at all costs. But it is much easier when these policies are in place. They already have funds with us. Which a lot of congregations, when they get to the termination point, they have that, and so it is a pretty simple process for us, unless some other unforeseen activities or actions. But oftentimes it can be a pretty smooth transition.
Okay, I'll stop interrupting you. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. One of the things we just talked about in our whole marketing component is to say thanks. Find ways to tell people thank you, especially those folks who felt that they didn't have those enormous estates. But that $1,000, any gift, I believe, is sacred because it comes from someone's sincere belief of the gospel of the local congregation, particularly, that has supported and sustained them. They may not want a lot to do a lot of show about a gift. I worked with a donor who, lovely man, sold a business and tithed his business sale, and it's created a permanent fund with a substantial amount of money and wants to remain anonymous. That happens, but those folks, letters of appreciation, visits, etc., that's always important. Some congregations really do celebrate through All Saints Day or Epiphany those folks who have left gifts to the life of the church. There are permanent wall plaques, annual listing, any number of ways that someone's name is retained within the life of the church and amongst the saints. Bobby, quick story, you know this one well. My sister and brother-in-law in Kansas City, when their son, my nephew, passed away, created a scholarship fund, and one of the major reasons was to retain his name within the life of the community. The scholarship fund is their way of saying our son still has a meaningful witness to others who are coming along. And so it's just an excellent way to remember that there are people watching those names, and it's a way of saying thank you. We can never quite do that enough.
Amen.
Absolutely. And some people will say, well, the person's already deceased. How can I thank them? You thank them in worship. even if it's just a brief sentence or two in connection with the stewardship moment. We've received a legacy gift from Mrs. Jones, who passed away a few months ago. We want to dedicate that in worship today. She may have family members sitting in the pews. Other potential donors may be watching how you do or don't show gratitude and appreciation for those kinds of gifts. So that's just important.
Well, and I think that point that Marilyn made, that these are sacred gifts.
That's
and
right.
So we are thanking the donors, but we're also thanking God when we do that.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
expressing gratitude. I will say one thing, these letters of appreciation, I have had terrible handwriting my entire life. And so self-conscious about writing those letters and cards of thanks in my own hand. And I heard a fairly generous giver talk about the fact that his pastor has very poor handwriting, but how meaningful it is that he gets that card written in his pastor's own hand saying thank you. And so I want to encourage our pastors to, I'm not good about it. And so, it's a statement to myself as well to write those thank yous, not just the letters, but also that handwritten card that says, we appreciate you. So.
Absolutely. I want to make another kind of shift in our conversation and talk about how it is that we manage endowment funds at the Christian Church Foundation. Marilyn alluded to this earlier when she was talking about the distribution from permanent funds. Our goal is to earn approximately 7.5%. We distribute 4 or 4.25%. And that way you're always putting money back into the corpus of the fund to mitigate the impact of inflation over time. Our twin goals, our investment philosophy is to always be distributing money to fund current ministries and retain a portion of the buying power of the dollar to mitigate the impact of inflation. That's just important. And that's the nature of a long-term strategy. That's different than a savings account or other types of investments that an individual or a congregation might have. Part of our investment strategy and part of our mandate, if you will, is governed by something called the Prudent Investor Rule. In this slide that you have up there now, it has some bullet points. I'm just going to hit a couple of them, but the first one is really the most important. Sound diversification is fundamental and required of fiduciaries or trustees who manage these kinds of funds. Well, what does that mean? It means you should not take all of your assets and put them in CDs or bonds or fixed income. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have some fixed income as a part of your asset allocation. In the same way, you should not put 100% in aggressive growth stocks. There ought to be a level of diversification that helps mitigate some of the negative impact of fluctuations in the market over time. You have a responsibility to avoid unnecessary and unjustified fees and expenses. Trustees must balance production of current income against the protection of purchasing power. That again is what I said about you spend enough to fund current ministry, but not so much that you're decreasing the corpus of the fund over time. The last bullet point there, trustees have a duty to delegate decisions as prudent investors would. You need to trust the advice and counsel of professional managers. And while and I appreciate the fact that you said earlier, Marilyn and I are both ordained ministers, we talk about what we do first as ministry, but that's not to say at the Christian Church Foundation, we have, for lack of a better term, a whole slew of accountants in the back office. We have 6 or 8 accountants, and we have a consulting firm that helps us do the due diligence of overseeing effectively, efficiently, and prudently $940 or $50 million in assets that we hold as a sacred responsibility.
And Bobby, go ahead, Marilyn.
Oh, okay, Bobby, you may have it coming up, but one of the other things on the prudent investment rule and the trustees and their role and responsibility, one of the things we always do advocate for is that there's not a conflict of interest. There are any number of times that I've had some congregations, there's someone who has enough connections that they may be with another investment firm, et cetera. And sometimes that can be really dicey, really tricky for a congregation when they use someone so heavily connected to the congregation. When things go sideways, shall we say, when the market does something, then they feel badly. It's just one of those things where Christian Church Foundation is that honest broker, as we say. It's not someone who is so closely embedded with the church that you end up with any conflict. Bobby, I'm sorry.
No. I think that's a great comment. And if I can just piggyback on that, one of the things you just said, we're not as closely invested in the local congregation, and yet we are intimately, our goals are aligned. We have our own endowment funds invested in the same funds that we encourage congregations to invest with in our funds. So we have mutual interest, and we have a sense of partnership with the whole church.
Bobby and Marilyn, thank you. Within your own investment, the foundation's own investment philosophy, I would imagine that ethical investing, not investing in companies that have a track record of abuse, or I'm not sure what the right language here is, but can you say a little bit about that from Foundation's perspective?
Marilyn, you want to take that, or you want me to?
Yes. One of the things, and we have become, even, dare we say, our staff, particularly development staff, we are with ICCR, and Bobby, sometimes I can't get it all right, but for corporate responsibility.
Interfaith Council on Corporate Responsibility. And if anybody wants more information about that, it's very simple to go to iccr.org. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Marilyn.
One of the things that we do is really, it allows us to be on point and up to speed. Our development staff has even gotten involved. We can look at some of the committees that deal with things about human trafficking, arms, Palestinian, Israeli issues, any number of issues that we say we want to have good resources. We want to have good returns, but not on the backs and at the expense of humanity. One of the funds that we just created, the Bostic Select Fund, and you can go on the web and look at that fund. It has some things that it screens against certain things. We vote proxies. That Gary Kidwell has been involved in letter writing to corporations who are doing some things that have negative impacts. We take that very seriously. We don't want to have good returns and at the expense of the least among us. Bobby, go ahead.
No, I appreciate that. So there's two ways to do socially responsible investing. One is to try to have impact on the companies that you invest in by voting proxies, and as Marilyn said, letter writing, and as a shareholder to try to influence the board and influence the company. We do that with all of our funds across the board through ICCR, Interfaith Committee on Corporate Responsibility. And then we created the Bostic Select Fund, and it takes it a step further and takes a little bit of a different track. It is still votes proxies on a lot of the shares that we own and those investments, but we also made a decision. And part of this came about as a result of some input from some of our current and potential investors. They said, we want a company we want an investment fund that does not involve investment in the fossil fuel industry. We want an investment fund that does not invest in the arms race, national gun manufacturers. We want a investment fund that boycotts companies that contribute to the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. So the Bostic Select Fund basically excludes, it sets certain filters and excludes those companies in its investment protocol. Okay?
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, thanks.
The next slide really talks a lot about why a congregation would want to, a congregation or region or other ministry partner would want to invest with the Christian Church Foundation. And I'm going to just move on, Andy, for the sake of time. The next slide has a lot of information in it, but what I want to say about this slide is that this reflects a commitment to a strategic investment discipline. We are not involved in trying to be involved in market timing, certainly not day trading, any of those kinds of things that you hear about, but we set a discipline of establishing investment goals and strategies, return objectives, risk assessment. And from those bottom kind of tiered foundations, the risk assessment and the return objectives, then we create an asset allocation. Then we, based on our asset allocation, we select managers. And we do that in partnership with a consulting firm that helps us do manager searches. And then we monitor and oversee the performance of those managers over time. As you can see in the next several slides, and I'm not going to go into each one of these. We can actually kind of flip through the next 5 slides fairly quickly, but we've got 5 different funds that are available for congregations and other ministry partners like the region and other regional ministries to invest their endowment funds in one or more of these 5 funds.
So the investor, the congregation, or the individual or the entity that's creating their own investment with foundation would choose which of these funds to put their money into?
That's correct. Now, I want to correct one thing. You said that the congregation or the individual. Individuals cannot invest with the Christian Church Foundation. They can create named permanent funds, so it's an irrevocable gift. Okay. Congregations and other ministry partners like that have assets that have been gifted to them that then they can turn around and invest with us. Okay. For individually named permanent funds, we have a default fund, which all of new permanent funds are going to go into the Bostic Select Fund, unless a donor specifically knows about these 5 funds and says, no, I'd rather it go in the Common Balance Fund, or I'd rather it go in the Beasley Fund. Then they can direct it. But the Bostic Fund is going to be our default fund for all new individually named permanent funds. Gotcha. Congregations and other investing partners who are investing their assets with us choose which of these fund or funds they want to invest in.
Okay.
And some of that, Andy, as you know, is based on their tolerance. There are some folks, as you look at these pie charts and how the funds are allocated, some of this is based on their tolerance. Some of it, as Bobby mentioned with our Bostic Fund, was specific need and requests by investors, but some of it is really based on, with the long-term strategy, they're willing to say, okay, when the market is fabulous and the Beasley Fund is soaring, yes, that looks good. They're also sometimes willing to say 2008 comes along and we do a Maylocks moment, shall we say, but yeah, part of it is based on what their tolerance are, what they feel their objectives are. Many congregations have money invested for different reasons in more than one fund because they want it to do, they have they want to accomplish.
Well, I could see, for instance, you mentioned some of the commitments, the values, and I don't question those on the Bostic Fund, but particularly around fossil fuels, that's a part of Texas economy. And so that might be a place where we say, you know what, that's not as important to us. We're going to invest in Beasley or Campbell or one of the other funds. And, sure.
Absolutely. Some of it is regionally based. There we say some of my West Coast folks, they are thrilled with the Bostic Fund, but yeah, Texas, we know where our bread and butter comes from.
But I've been surprised about how many new investment accounts here in Texas and Oklahoma, which is also heavily invested in the oil industry, have moved assets into the Bostic Fund. So,
but that's the value of being able to do this, is you look at the values that are undergirding those funds and able to make choices based on your own values as well.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Great. Yeah. Are we ready to move on?
So yeah, the next slide really is just, it's based on our fund returns as of 12/31 of 2020. So the end of last year, you can see the 1 year ending in 12/31, the common balance fund had a return of 10.8%, the Beasley Growth Fund 11.5, and read on down there. And then you can look off to the right and see what the 3, 5, and 10-year averages were. I met with a group of trustees recently, and they were a little bit confused by that. So what is this Morningstar Moderate Fund? Well, the Morningstar, many people are familiar with, is kind of a benchmark by which we do comparisons to say, how are our funds performing in relation to the rest of the investment universe, if you will. So that Morningstar Moderate Fund is the one that's most closely aligned with the allocation in our common balance fund. The Morningstar Growth Fund is the one that's most commonly aligned with the Beasley, and on down the list. So that's just for our viewers today to look at and consider, partly in terms of their planning strategy, but just to see, while it's important to be, I think, invested with the Christian Church Foundation because of our faith and because of our church partnership, we don't put returns as a secondary issue, if you will. Our goal is to have as good a returns as you can find anywhere in the market.
Thanks. That's helpful.
The last couple of slides, I'm going to pass it back to Marilyn, and we've alluded to this earlier in our conversation a time or two, but talk a little bit about legacy congregations.
Thank you, Bobby. A reality is this: not all congregations will continue their visible ministry. Other than our people, our folks who have been faithful and sat in those pews for numerous years, the other major assets we may have, or whatever funds are still left in the church coffers and the church building. What happens when a congregation decides to close? One of the things I would advocate is do not just give it away. There are congregations, disciple churches, who literally had their final worship service and gave the keys of the church, turned it all over to another worshiping entity. And that's fine. It continues the gospel. But I would also make the case that those faithful disciples who spent years building and stewarding that community of faith, there's a way that congregation can live on. And so we do that with our legacy congregations. One of the things, Andy, you would know this well, Bobby and I both do, is that it's a delicate dance of helping the congregation make that decision, but also as we journey and walk with them is to make sure that we are available to them to help them make good decisions. One of the things that is included in that is how vulnerable a congregation can be towards the end of its lifetime. Another group may come in, we call it steeplejacking, can come in and probably within a matter of months or a very short time period, virtually take over a congregation. It has happened, and it is unfortunate. So we have some documents that we have. One of them is called a termination clause. We really encourage a congregation to have some things in place to protect their assets while they are making that decision. And they can partner with the region or area to make sure that they are involved all along the way, so that the church in a vulnerable position is not met with, dare we say, a takeover. What can happen then as the church goes through a closing process, we have some resources to help make all those decisions, what to do with some physical assets, pianos and pews and Bibles, et cetera, that can be shared with others. And that process of creating a permanent fund agreement, a legacy fund gift agreement, where those things can be distributed. How that permanent fund will do, as we've talked about all through this meeting, can distribute to those ministries that the congregation has felt strongly about. Sometimes it may be all to one particular entity, but oftentimes there are several things that a congregation has supported and they continue to support through the legacy concept, the permanent fund legacy gift agreement.
Marilyn, can I jump in and
Sure.
make one other comment about closing congregations? I think one of the things that happens inevitably at the end of a congregation's lifetime is sometimes there becomes some anger and some contention. There's a lot of grief over losing a congregation, over a congregation's death. And they blame the minister, they blame the region or the general church that we didn't do enough for them to help them. Why weren't you there when we needed you? Our role oftentimes that Marilyn and I and our other colleagues play is to be pastors to them and listen, but then to also guide them. And we direct them to help make their legacy gift agreement in such a way that reflects their history. If they historically gave to Juliet Fowler Homes and Global Ministries and made a gift to the region every year, if the region helped fund the starting of that congregation, it would be appropriate to include the region in their legacy gift agreement. But ultimately our role is to listen and help them sort that out. I oftentimes think, we sometimes know why a congregation closes, the old changing neighborhood syndrome, or a rural congregation in a small town that is literally the town itself is dying and the population is moving away. But some of you know my wife is a nurse and a nursing professor, and I learned the term about medicine called idiopathic. I love that word. I just think it's funny. But sometimes that's true of congregations in their closing days. And all that means is really, we don't know. We cannot come up with an accurate diagnosis to know the cause of this disease. And that's sometimes true of churches. It is just part of their life cycle that they're going to die and they're going to close. So our role as pastors and as the foundation is to walk with them in that journey and to grieve with them when the time comes.
The other thing that I've experienced, and it's sitting there as dare we say, not only as one of the pastors, but sitting a little further away from their history, is when we open those questions and they begin to tell their history and see the possibility of how that history is being birthed again with this legacy fund. It's been amazing to me to see the joy that comes to know that even though they may not gather, and some of them periodically gather as, have a little reunion time annually, but to know that they still have that resurrection, that new life has come. And when they get to sit and tell those stories and talk about, well, we can give something to Week of Compassion or to the region or to the campsite, it is reinvigorating for them that they do see that on. And I'm grateful that Christian Church Foundation is an avenue that can work along with our regional partners, walk congregations through that process.
Amen. Bobby, Marilyn, thank you so much for your time. We've been doing this for about an hour, and that's about as much as we can sustain, I suspect. This is a lot of your time, and I really am grateful for it. I'm going to put the contact information up here on the screen real quick. You can reach Bobby Hawley at bhawley@ccf.disciples.org and Marilyn Fiddmont at mfiddmont@ccf.disciples.org. Closing words, Marilyn, you're muted on my end, friend.
I'm so sorry. You have to take the T off the Fiddmont. They didn't give. There really is a T, but not for my email.
Okay.
Yeah, take a T off for me.
Fiddmont.
Thank you. No T.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But reach out to these two great folk if you are in those spaces. And I'm imagining that we might get a few people who are not part of the Christian Church in the Southwest, so not in New Mexico or not in Texas. And so they could call the foundation itself and find out who is the Bobby or Marilyn in their neck of the woods, I'm sure. So, but again, thank you both very much. If it's okay, I'd like to conclude us in prayer. And you guys want to say some final words, but I'd like to close us in prayer.
It has been a joy to be in ministry and partnership, not only with you, Andy, and Bobby, but with the wonderful people and congregations we meet. It has been a great joy.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. God bless. Loving God, we thank you for the work that you have entrusted to our hands. I thank you for these two faithful stewards and servants of your church, for Marilyn, for Bobby, for their joy, for the joy that they have in friendship with one another and the ways in which their friendship informs the collegiality in the life of our church, for the Christian Church Foundation, for the ways in which it demonstrates faithful stewardship, ethical investment, a vision for the future, and capacity to think about the present. We give you thanks. We pray that you watch over their ministries, watch over the Christian Church Foundation, and allow all of us to work together for your glory. And that what we do and say points to your grace. We love you, O God. We place our lives in your hands. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Thank
Friends,
you.
thank you so much.
Take care.